Okay, I think we're starting to level out on our people that are logging in. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Rick Clarkson, who will be continuing the presentation. Thanks.
Thanks, Craig. Just making sure you all can hear me.
We can.
Great, thanks very much. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully you all can see that as well.
We can.
Great, thanks. So again, thanks everyone who's joined us this afternoon. This is the second in recent days, at least, of stakeholder information sessions that the department has held to discuss our intentions to release a draft rule associated with landfill leachate treatment. The first information session that we held was on January 27th. And this is the second of those two. So we also have posted information. If you're on this webinar, you probably have been to this website to sign up for this webinar, but that same location where you signed up is also where we're posting information. We're posting slides. The slides that we're using today will also be posted up there. The recording of this session will be posted up there, as the recording is from the January 27th session. And so that's our location where we're posting all kinds of information associated with this proposed rule. So if you want to check in, we also are going to be distributing information to folks who have shared their email address with us as we move forward with the process. So we'll do some email blasts and try to make sure everybody's aware of our progress as we move forward. We will post to the chat the link to that page, just so everybody has the link. For folks who might be listening to this later on and don't have access to that link, simply going to a web browser and searching NYSDEC landfill leachate will bring you to the solid waste management regulatory revisions page, and that's the page where we're posting this information. So that's a place to look for any updates, at least in the interim before the rule gets posted or released. Again, we had excellent turnout, excellent interest in this, and so we appreciate that interest. We had, I'm not sure, now that I've got the presentation up, I don't know exactly how many folks we have with us. We had over 100 when I got started. We had over 388 some odd people sign up, which is even more than we had for the original, the first in January. So we definitely appreciate that interest. The format of what we're going to go through today is I have 10 or 12 slides that I'm going to walk through to give some of the background, to give some of the broader flavor of what we're intending to do with this rule. The rule is not finalized yet. It's not been released. So if you think that you missed something, you haven't yet. It hasn't been released. This is all pre-proposal, the conversations, which is why some of the conversations that we have and some of the information we have might seem a little bit vague. It's not intentionally vague. It's just that we haven't had finalized rule yet to release. We do have intention, we talked about in the last session, and I'll repeat here probably several times, that we will set up a similar stakeholder meeting during the comment period. That's after the rule is actually released, so folks can get a look at the specific rulemaking package that will be released associated with the rule. That will include the express terms, which is the actual language of the regulation and of the proposed draft regulation, and it will also include supporting documents that give more explanation of what our intentions are. There's a lot of supporting information in all those supporting documents that you can read through and get a real handle on what the intentions are and what the actual changes would be in the regulation. Then at some point, I assume relatively early on in the comment period, we'll set up another stakeholder meeting to get more feedback, to get more questions from you all. That at the end of just to give a little more detail on the process, at the end of the comment period, there will be an official session, comment hearing, where folks can come on. There won't be a give and take in that event. That will be a place where people can come on and give oral comments that will be officially received into the record and that we'll respond to as part of our process for finalizing the rule. That will be at the end of the comment period. I'll give a little more detail on that process as we go through. So the other thing as we go forward now, after I'm done with going through the slides, I'll walk through some in the slides. I'll walk through some of the comments that we've received in previous outreach that we've done. And then also in the January session, we got a lot of comments. And so we are answering, we're going to use that process to, we're going to use the chat feature in order to take comments today, just like we did in the January stakeholder meeting. And so we've collected all of the comments that we got during that first stakeholder meeting, and we're going to go through the vast majority of those at the end of my remarks. And so you might submit comments earlier on or submit a question early on in the chat that we'll get to already through the chat. And so then at the end, if there are any if there's additional time and we have additional questions in the chat, we'll go through some of the questions that have come today. So please post all your questions that you might have through the chat feature, and that's the way we'll handle it, just given the number of people. And that's the way we handled it during the January session, and it seemed to work out pretty well. In the meantime, if you have any additional after we're done today, if you have any other questions or other comments, we'll post, if we haven't already, on the chat, the solid waste regulations email address that you can use both to submit comments, informal comments, if you will, before the rule is released as a draft, or during the comment period, you can submit comments to that email address as well. That's we'll take comments at any point, and we'll take your feedback at any time you want to share it. But we certainly would encourage you, once the rule is released as a proposal, to submit comments in that way. And so that is that's going to be an important part of it's always an important part of our process to receive feedback and comments on the draft rule. We get to the point where we think it's complete and ready, but inevitably, every time we release a draft rulemaking, we get valuable comments that we usually need to make some adjustments to the rule. And so that's, it's a valuable part of our process. And so it really would be important for us to hear back from you during the comment period in any way that you, either if you want to do it orally at the hearing or written comments, either way, we look forward to hearing those comments. So let's get started. This first slide is just giving a little bit of background, just in case you're not familiar. There might be some folks on who are just wondering, I don't even know what you're doing. So I want to hear some of the basics of what you're trying to do. So some of these basics. So one of the things we're focusing on is leachate, and leachate is generated at landfills. It's generated in several different ways. It's either generated by percolation of precipitation, either snow or rain, that falls on the open portion of a landfill, and that works its way through the waste, collects contaminants that might be in that waste. Then the other way that liquid or water is generated in a landfill is through decomposition of organic wastes that are received at the landfill. That process also generates water. Both of those processes, that water is generated, and as it seeps through the waste, it collects any contaminants that might be in the waste, or it adds it to the water. And that leachate in our landfills that are currently permitted under our programs, it's collected in a leachate collection system. And in the past, so let me just go bit by bit. So the landfill, they're designed that way. They have liners to stop any of that leachate from getting into the groundwater at the landfill site. And that's been something that we've had in place since the late 80s, early 90s. We've had very significant liner requirements in our state rules in order to make sure that that groundwater is protected at the site. Unfortunately, up till now, the standard method for treating that leachate has been to send it to a wastewater treatment plant. The WRRF is water resource recovery facilities. I stumbled over this many times in our first session, so what I'd like to just do is say wastewater treatment plants from here on out. So when you see WRRF, that's a wastewater treatment plant. You may also see in other places it's called POTW. all of those are referring to a wastewater treatment plant at the end of the pipe from a sewer or from directed liquid wastes that are delivered to the facility. We're going to call them wastewater treatment plants for the rest of the session. So that's been the method of disposing of or treating landfill leachate since landfill leachate began to be collected under our programs. Those wastewater treatment plants are designed for biological treatment processes. They're designed for sanitary waste that goes through the sewers. They're not typically designed to treat many of the contaminants, the chemical contaminants that are found in landfill leachate. However, there are technologies now that are available, and they've been used in other places, in other landfills, in landfills in other states, and in New York State. They've been used to concentrate those contaminants and to reduce the volume of the contaminated leachate in order to ease the treatment or to reduce the cost in some cases of treating that leachate. So that that's the effort that we're going through right now to move forward with a rulemaking that would require that treatment of that leachate prior to it being sent to a wastewater treatment plant. And we'll get into more detail as we go. So this has been done in the past, as I said, both in New York and in other states. This is just an example from a professional journal from a couple of years ago. So the treatment processes have been established at landfills to reduce the volume, and in some cases to stabilize or solidify the treated or the residue from those treatment processes, and that goes back into the landfill. So that effort removes those contaminants, keeps them in the landfill where they're intended to be from the beginning, where they were sent from the very beginning, and reduces the contaminants that are redirected back out into the environment. And that's our goal under this rulemaking. So as I said, our goal is to minimize the reintroduction of contaminants out into the world. So the facilities that are focused on in the draft rule as we sit right now are active municipal solid waste landfills and active construction and demolition debris landfills with leachate collection systems embedded. Not all C&D debris landfills have leachate collection systems. Those that have restricted types of waste that they're allowed to take in some cases don't, but the majority of large C&D facilities, C&D debris landfills do have leachate collection. So the rule as it's envisioned right now would require treatment of that leachate before that treated leachate stream is delivered to a wastewater treatment plant or another authorized discharge location. And I'll get into a little bit more of that as we go. And then that concentrated remainder where it's a much smaller volume, it's probably about 10% or so of the total volume, depending on the treatment technology that's used. That concentrated smaller volume would be solidified, with something would be added to it in order to solidify, and then it would go back into the landfill. Therefore, basically restricting the ability of that leachate or the contaminants in that leachate to get into the leachate again. So as I said, we do have a draft package and ready. We are tinkering with it based on feedback we've gotten, and we'll continue to tinker with it until we get final approval to release. But it is currently under review right now. This effort was mentioned this year in the governor's State of the State book, at the very least. So it's got a lot of attention, both from the regulated community and from the environmental community, understandably, and also from our leadership. And so we appreciate that attention. The interesting thing going forward, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, there's more to be coming down the road. But not only was it mentioned here that the rulemaking was going to be pursued in order to keep these contaminants from getting back out into the environment, but it also mentions in this State of the State language that there would be funding for local governments, to local governments, in order to help them comply with the rule. There's not a lot of information on that right now. There's currently a budget negotiation process that's happening in the state, and so as that works its way through the process, we'll get more information about the details on that. And there'll be more to come on that. We'll share it as much as we can, as broadly as we can, when those details are available. So here's some of the details on the regulated community, sort of, and what we're dealing with right now in the state. So we have 25 active municipal solid waste landfills in New York State right now. And we have 7 active C&D debris landfills with leachate collection systems. We have 32 total facilities that are going to be the focus of this rule right now. Those, as I mentioned, those landfills currently, when they generate that leachate, they currently send that leachate to wastewater treatment plants in the state. They send them to a variety of wastewater treatment plants. The requirements that we have is they have to show us and they have to get into contracts with disposal facilities like a wastewater treatment plant. So there are 35 of those wastewater treatment plants right now in the state that receive leachate from these landfills. Just for context, there are about 600 total wastewater treatment plants in New York State right now. These are referred to as municipal. These are facilities that are dealing with municipal waste, so they're not industrial, but there are about 600 of them in the state. Only 35 of them, I won't say only, 35 of them are receiving leachate from landfills right now. And the total volume from these active facilities is over 500 million gallons per year of leachate that is being generated from these from these active facilities. So under what we're considering, and under the draft rule as we have it envisioned right now, once this rule came into place, there'd be a transition period, and I'll talk about that a little more. But at the end of that transition period, the leachate that is generated by these landfills would have to be treated before, and it would have to be treated by a Part 360 series permitted facility before the remaining material or the treated leachate is either released to a wastewater treatment plant or released through its own speedies or other outfall. We're trying to make this rule flexible while also making sure that it's effective and protective. And so we aren't requiring that the leachate treatment happen at the landfill. We just are requiring that the leachate treatment happen before the leachate gets sent to a wastewater treatment plant. So the treatment facility could be constructed at the landfill where the leachate is generated. It theoretically could get treated at another landfill. There's a potential under this rule that a landfill could choose to build a treatment system and increase its capacity to be able to take in leachate from other landfills. That's a possibility under this rule as it's currently envisioned. Then there's also a possibility under this rule of having a third-party location. That's not even a landfill, but it's a facility that comes to us, gets permitted to be able to treat landfill leachate, and that's what they do. They take leachate, they treat it, and then the concentrated material would be sent to a landfill offsite. All of those things are possibilities, they're possibilities within the framework of the rule. And again, we're trying to make it so that it's not that it's effective and protective, but also flexible so that the industry and the municipalities that operate landfills can meet the requirements in the most efficient way possible. We also in the rule aren't explicitly specifying the treatment method or the treatment technology that needs to be used. We would be setting instead a performance standard that sets a requirement that the facility has to meet with whatever technology they want to use. Under the current thought, we're looking at a performance standard of approximately we're looking at a performance standard of 99.9% reduction of the contaminant in the raw leachate. That has to be reduced by 99.9% in the treated leachate before it can move on to wherever its next destination is. But I want to be clear that just because we're not specifying the technology that needs to be used, doesn't mean that we as a department wouldn't have oversight over that technology. So as part of the process of that would go through the implementation of this, a facility, whether it be the landfill where it's being treated or a third-party facility, would have to come in with a permit application describing the technology that they're going to use, and then providing sufficient supporting documentation to the department for a permit review in order to approve the technology that's been chosen by the facility. The other detail here is that we don't identify specific target contaminants. One of the reasons for that is that each landfill leachate is sort of unique. They're at least individual, and some landfill leachates may have contaminants that others don't. We have in our current rules, we have in this reference location, part 363-4.6H, there are tables that include analytes that are required to be sampled for in landfill leachate currently. And those are the analytes that would be used to set those criteria. So those analytes, whether they be PFAS compounds, or whether they be heavy metals, or whether they be other industrial chemicals, organic or semi-organic chemicals, those would be on a site-by-site basis would be the contaminants that would have to be identified that through the treatment process are being reduced by at least 99.9%. And so I'll have more to say about that as we go forward. But as I say, we want to make it as a flexible system so that it's efficient and protective, and so that it can be used in a variety of different ways. The other potential solution that a landfill might choose, especially you can imagine a hypothetical where there's a small landfill that doesn't generate as much leachate as a larger facility. And so the cost per gallon of installing or building a treatment system won't be as good as for a larger system. So that might be a landfill that might want to choose to go onto a potential market. It might want to find another landfill that has sufficient capacity, or might want to find one of these third-party locations in order to send its leachate to one of those facilities. That's also envisioned within this rule. So I've mentioned a couple times the transition process, or how we would get through our going from where we are right now to a proposed rule, to a final rule, to actually treating landfill leachate in the state. So, and I'll talk in more detail about this in some of the questions as we go forward, but we have once we release a proposed rule, we have about within a year to actually finalize that rule. And I'll talk more about that in a while. So say, for example, it takes us a full year or whatever time it takes. Once the rule is effective, we have embedded in the rulemaking, and you'll see once we propose it, the details on this. We have a transition process to be able to move facilities from where they are right now to the endpoint of being able to treat their leachate. So at the end of year one, after the rule has been finalized, each landfill in the state, each one of these 32 landfills that are the focus of the rule, would have to submit to the department a conceptual treatment plan. And that would have to describe to the department their intentions about what they're going to do with their leachate, whether they intend to build their own treatment system, or whether they intend to partner with another landfill and they're going to enter a contract with another landfill, or whether they're going to enter a contract with a third-party location. It's got to be what their intentions are at that point after 1 year. At the end of the second year after the rule is finalized, the facilities would be required to submit a final treatment plan. And that would be much more specific with if the landfill is going to build on site, or it's going to build someplace. They'd have to identify the technologies that they're using and submit supporting documentation for the technologies that they want to use. And at that point, at the latest, they'd have to submit associated permit applications, because each one of these activities will likely require a permit modification for a landfill, or will need a permit for the activity. That's the deadline for that. Those things could be submitted earlier if a landfill is ready to do it earlier, but the deadline to submit those things would be at the end of year 2. So that's 2 years into our process. Then we leave 2 years for a facility for the permits to be approved and for the construction to take place in order for the leachate to be treated. So that means under the rule, at the end of year 4, the treatment of the leachate would be required in order before that leachate could go to a wastewater treatment plant. We want to do this as fast as possible. We want to move to treatment of the leachate as fast as possible, but there are these evolution, there's this movement of the facilities into a point where they're ready to treat the leachate that we have to understand, and we have to give reasonable amount of time to. And so we've decided that that 4-year time frame with those internal deadlines is the right time frame. That's going to be in the draft. We'll take comments on that during the process. We'll take comments on all of this during the once the draft rule is released during the comment period, in order to get feedback from the public and from the regulated communities about what we're planning on doing, and we'll take them under consideration as we move through that process. So as I said, there are costs that are going to be associated with this treatment process. In the supporting documents, once they're released, you'll be able to see we've done some analysis of what those costs might be. I will say from the beginning, though, that those are rough estimates, only because we have to. It's unknown to us right now, and it will be unknown to us for a period of time, what choices the individual landfills are going to pursue as far as their treatment. And the choices will change the costs associated with that treatment. So if a landfill builds a treatment facility on site, that will be a different cost than if a landfill chooses to send its leachate offsite and pay for its treatment at another facility. So those costs are very rough, but we chose, in order to meet our obligations, we chose a type of technology that we know could work. And we identified a cost associated with each of the landfills that are included under this rule, and we did an estimate of the costs associated with that treatment system being built at that facility. We would welcome comments on our approach on that as well during the comment period. There are, for municipalities, there are funding opportunities to be able to help support this work. There's federal grants that are available under the bipartisan infrastructure law associated with emerging contaminants. Emerging contaminants are one of the contaminants that are included in this rule, PFAS specifically, and not just total PFAS, but a broad number of specific PFAS compounds. So that makes that activity eligible for the BIL grants under that program. The links here, once we post, and the posted, these same slides or very similar slides are already posted on our website. They should be hot links, so you could click on this and go directly to the EPA websites associated with these grant opportunities. And also, as I mentioned earlier, there should be information as the budget process unfolds. There will likely be information associated with other state funding opportunities in order to support municipal landfills and the expense associated with both designing and building a treatment facility for municipalities. So there will be more information in the draft rule when it's released, and more information as we go forward associated with those potential funding opportunities. So this is an important slide, and I think it gives a little more depth, and because there are a variety. I'm in the Division of Materials Management. Our focus is the operation of landfills and the kind of the solid waste component of the landfills. But there are other parts of the department who have oversight over landfills and over different parts of our programs. And the Division of Water is another program that has an involvement associated with this. The Division of Water has established surface water action levels that set specific limits on the amount of particular contaminants that can be released from wastewater treatment plants or from any SPDES permitted facility. And so our approach on this rule is not to duplicate the work that DOW does at their wastewater treatment plants. It is to what we're considering to be sort of a mass basis. We want to see, that's why we are choosing 99.9% as the performance standard. So that is not a health-based limit. It is basically a notion that those contaminants that were sent to that landfill were intended to stay at that landfill. And so this treatment process should maximize, to the extent possible, the amount of those contaminants that are retained at that landfill. And so the 99.9% is our choice of number to be able to, that we're saying that that's the minimum amount of material that should be retained in that landfill. And that is going to be specific to the specific contaminants that we're talking about. So it's specific to the industrial chemicals, heavy metals, or the PFAS or enriched contaminants that are in that landfill leachate. Then once that requirement is met and the concentrated leachate is solidified and goes back into a landfill, then there's the remaining effluent, it might be called, or treated leachate that would need to go someplace. It's very likely that the volume of that treated leachate is going to be a large percentage of the total raw leachate. So we would expect once it's treated, there might be, as I said earlier, there could be 90% of the total volume that's now this treated leachate stream, and it has to meet those requirements of that 99.9% reduction. Then that material needs to go someplace. So it could go to a wastewater treatment plant. And if it does, then that wastewater treatment plant, that material would be taken into consideration by the wastewater treatment plant under Division of Water regulations and under permits to determine what's acceptable to be received at that wastewater treatment plant. If there's a possibility that that leachate could be treated so well that it would be clean enough to be able to be discharged through its own speedies permit, it would not have to go to a wastewater treatment plant. That would also be covered under a permit. That activity would have to be permitted by Division of Water. And so it would have the same oversight, that same health and ecological risk-based oversight that DOW would apply at a wastewater treatment plant to a direct discharge speedies permit. And so there's sort of this 1-2 action that we're contemplating. We're restricting as to the extent that we think is reasonable and possible the concentration of the contaminants in that leachate, keeping that in the landfill, and then that residual treated stream would still have to go through and get evaluated by Division of Water rules under their health and ecological risk-based limits. And so we think that's a nice balance. We think that's complementary to our programs. We're not duplicating the process that the Division of Water has, but we should be reducing the loading of those types of chemicals that go into those wastewater treatment plants, at least from landfill leachate. And so that, I'll go into some more detail on some of the questions that you may have already have, and you may already be in the chat as I go through some of the questions that we received in the January session. But I'll start going a little bit back further. We've been developing this rule, or at least contemplating this rule, for several years now. And in 2023, we held 2 stakeholder meetings in the very beginning, before we had any of the details that we have right now. We just wanted to we had a concept of what we wanted to do. And so we wanted to get feedback from folks about that approach. And so we had 2 of those stakeholder meetings in 2023. And now we're having these additional ones as sort of the end of our development process associated with this rule. So I want to go through some of the thoughts or questions that we had in those original stakeholder meetings and some of the feedback that we've gotten. So our original questions from that 2023 stakeholder meeting were some of these. We wanted to find out from folks who knew, either the regulated community or others who were municipalities or professionals in the industry. We wanted to find out if they can give us information about the treatment technologies and the solidification technologies that might be available. We wanted to understand what types of changes might happen for operational changes that would be required at a landfill in order to meet the requirements that we were proposing. The changes that we're talking about here are going to change the way leachate is managed and stored at a landfill. So we wanted to try to understand a little bit more about that, about if these rules went into effect, what type of capacity changes would be necessary at a landfill, and what kind of changes would be necessitated at a landfill. We're very concerned about odors at landfills, and so we wanted to find out if there were going to be any potential increases of odors, and so what odor control measures would be necessary in this enhanced treatment process in order to make sure those odors were not did not become a problem, did not become a nuisance to neighbors at the facilities. Leachate can be a source of odors, and so we wanted to make sure, and we wanted to pursue those kind of questions. We wanted to understand leachate sampling requirements. This will change. There will still be plenty of leachate sampling requirements associated with it, but it will change the nature of them. So we wanted to get feedback on that. We wanted to talk to them, to folks about this idea of accepting leachate from other facilities in order to be solidified at or treated or solidified at their sites. Alternative operating cover adjustments that may be required to it. Costs. We wanted to get feedback on costs. Transition to how and when this type of requirement should be transitioned. So we did not at that point have specificity about the conceptual plan, final plan, and when the final rule would actually be required. So we wanted to get feedback on that and timeframes that was felt like would be needed. And then how and when the requirements would change at the conclusion of waste acceptance. So in other words, when a landfill closed, what would be the requirements at that point? Would they continue? How would those change? We have a little bit more I'll talk about in the questions about what would happen at a landfill if it closes kind of during the transition period. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So those were the kind of questions that we had. So this is some of the feedback we got in that first set of conversations. So one of the concerns was there was a concern about an expedited rulemaking process. I think that was just a failure of mine about communication at that point. We were asking for feedback at that point. It was similar to what we have right now. It's unofficial, but there was concern about a time frame associated with that. Solidification of raw leachate was another thing that was a concern. We were talking about whether raw leachate untreated could be solidified. There was a lot of concern about the slope stabilities on a landfill associated with that solidification. If airspace would be used, that the full volume of leachate if it was solidified, that would take up a significant amount of airspace. There were other operators were identified specific requirements or specific issues with maybe that approach. And so that's why we are looking at a treatment process to reduce the volume as opposed to just straight solidification of raw leachate. It was mentioned at least, there are some relationships that exist right now that have evolved over the course of these development of landfills over the course of the past 40 or 50 years, where landfills and wastewater treatment plants might have a relationship with each other. There might be infrastructure. There are landfills in New York State that have dedicated sewer lines that go from a landfill to a wastewater treatment plant that's in close proximity to the landfill. So then there's financial arrangements between those two types of facilities. So those were concerns at that point. There was a concern, and it was understandable, about being specific about definitions. Like, so what are we talking about? What do we mean by raw? What do we mean by treated, effluent, condensate, byproducts? It was important for us to establish clearly as we can what we're talking about and how each of those definitions fit into the rule. There was a desire to get information about what the acceptable methods might be, whether they be volume reduction and what types of volume reduction, what types of pretreatment, or as much specificity as possible, and then associated with transition times. So how long would be given to a facility in order to work through this process? At the time, the comments suggested that 4 to 5 years was a recommended time frame, and so we've chosen 4 years because we agree that we think that that's a reasonable amount of time. We would like it to be faster, but we understand the needs and the time frames associated with design and construction and permitting associated with these facilities. So we understand that those things take time. So we tried to find the right balance, and that's why we're looking at a 4-year transition period. More recently, we've gotten other comments similar. There's been our standard comment period once a rule is released for public comment is 60 days. There's been discussion or requests to extend that comment period to allow for a broader or more time, at least, to review the documents. We've gotten comments and questions on every time we've talked about this recently, at least, about wanting to make the regulations applicable to all landfill leachates. I'll talk about that for a minute right now. We'll probably get to more of it as we're going through the rest of the questions. But the reason, some of the reasons that we've chosen to focus on at this point, we haven't released the rule yet, but at this point, some of the reasons we're thinking about focusing on active landfills is, one, it's the vast majority of leachate that's being generated in the state. We have something in the neighborhood of 1,900 closed, what we call inactive landfills in the state right now. The vast majority of those do not collect leachate because they were regulated and permitted, or if they were permitted, they operated at the time they operated under requirements that did not require leachate collection. We're talking about landfills that operated in the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s, and they have closed during those times. So at that point, landfill leachate wasn't required to be collected. And so there is no leachate that's being generated from those sites. So the volume of leachate that's generated from inactive landfills is much smaller than the volume that's being generated from active landfills. So those are some of the thought process that we had. The other piece of this is that this whole process, when we get to the end of the transition period and we get to the point where leachate needs to be treated, this whole process will create a new infrastructure in the state that doesn't exist right now for treating that leachate. It might end up with a system where all landfills are building and treating their own leachate. I think it's more likely, but we'll find out, that there will be some type of infrastructure that gets developed where leachate moves from facility to facility and is treated at different facilities. That infrastructure would allow for the leachate, the smaller volume of leachate that's being generated at some of the inactive sites, to have another place to go for disposal instead of a wastewater treatment plant. That option doesn't exist right now. And so those are some of the thoughts we have about wanting to focus on active landfills, the volumes, and the small volume that's being generated at inactive landfills. I'll just mention by the side, we have a whole program that we pursue. It's called the Inactive Landfill Initiative. We have annual reports associated with these landfills. It's available on our website. Google the Inactive Landfill Initiative, New York State, NYSDEC, and you'll be able to find it and see the work that we've done on those landfills. One of this associated with air impacts from leachate if it's used as blown in daily cover. Some landfills that we know of in other states that are doing this solidification, this treatment and solidification process, are using the concentrated leachate mixed in with a cement or a pozzolanic to solidify it, and then that is used as a blown in daily cover. If you're not familiar, every day at the end of the working day, there's a daily cover or an operating cover requirement that the waste in the open cell gets covered with something in order to reduce birds or other vectors from getting in, or to reduce odors, reduce fire potential, all those reasons. And so there are sites in other states that have used this material mixed with a cement material in order to close that, or in order to, as a blown in material. There was concern that's been voiced associated with the air impacts associated with that. So that would be something that would need to be looked at by the department before that would be approved. So that's a point that was set of concerns. And the last one on this slide, at least, is control of leachate moving inside and out of the state. This is a legal question. And so we have this question in front of our Office of General Counsel. There are federal restrictions, constitutional restrictions on states from setting limits on commerce that moves across state borders, and the movement of leachate in and or out of the state to be treated in another state, or receiving leachate that was generated in another state is a problem. There's a federal restriction on states being able to set those kind of restrictions that has already been established for waste being moved across state lines. But it would also, we think it would likely also be a concern or an issue with the state trying to set the limitations on it for landfill leachate. But it is a question. It's in front of our Office of General Counsel, and it's being given consideration associated with this potentially proposed rule. So those are the slides that I wanted to walk through. Now I want to spend a few minutes, and I know that you all have been seeing out of the corner of my eye that there's been questions coming in on the chat, and I appreciate that. We do have some questions that were already posed during the January 27th webinar, and I just want to go through those quickly because they may answer a lot of the questions that are already in the chat. And then once we're through with that, we'll have my colleagues feed any other questions that might have come in the chat that aren't addressed in this through the questions that came in previously. So let me walk through those quickly. So, and we kind of arrange them or organize them by topic. So the first set of topics is timing or the timing of rulemaking of the rulemaking process. So the first question is, when will proposed regulations be made available for review? And we don't have a good answer for that. We hope that it's going to happen soon. We want to get this rule out as soon as possible in order for the folks like you who are interested in it to be able to see the actual rule as a part of a proposed rulemaking. But we don't have a specific timeline. Once we do have a specific timeline, we will make everyone on this webinar and have been that we've talked to in other webinars aware of it. It will also be posted in the ENB, the environmental notice bulletin. That's our standard official notification of our rulemakings, but we'll also do blasts. We'll share through social media. We're going to share it as broadly as we can because we want as many people as we can to get access to it and see the actual comments so we can get your feedback. Another comment was, how long will you be accepting comments as part of the pre-proposal process? And so we are open to receiving comments as long as we are up until we actually release the proposed rule. I would emphasize though that if any comments that are received before the comment period actually begins, the formal comment period actually begins, would not be official comments. And so we want to hear back from you, but we would definitely emphasize that the formal comment period, once the rule is actually released and proposed, is important because that way your comments will actually be officially on the record. We'll respond to them in a response to comment process once the comment period is completed. And so we would emphasize that that's something that we would recommend for you to submit. We've already shared in the chat, there's solid waste regulations email address to submit those comments. We would ask that you include landfill leachate in the subject line when you submit those comments to make sure we are addressing your comments. Comment, can you explain the 1-year requirement process for the rule to be adopted once published? So this is some of the details in our secret process. This is a state set of regulations, laws and regulations that govern the process of the department and any other department issuing regulations. And so once when we issue the draft rule, it will be published in the environmental notice bulletin. And as I mentioned, we'll communicate as broadly as we can that we've issued it. There will be a specific time frame associated for comments. As I said, it typically is 60 days. We've already been asked to extend that, and it's under consideration. Then at the end of that comment period, we'll have the official formal comment hearing where folks can come in and verbally provide comments and also submit written comments if they'd like. That often happens. Then after that process, the department, we have an obligation to go through the comments, draft a response to comment document that will be issued as part of the final rule, make any adjustments we think are necessary based on the comments to the express terms, the actual language of the rule, and make any changes to supporting documents based on those comments. So that process will take place. And then all of those finalized versions would be released as a final rule, also would be notified through the environmental notice bulletin and through other means. So we're required to do that within 1 year. So from the year that we propose the rule, we're required to go through that entire process and finalize the rule within a year. If we don't do that, then we have to restart the process and go through the entire process again, new comment period, new supporting documents, everything that we did from the beginning, like we never even started. I should also note that one of the things that could happen, or things that has happened with us in rulemaking in the past, is if we release a draft rule and we receive comments that we think necessitate what we call substantive changes, then when we make those substantive changes, we would re-release the rule as a draft rule. And so because the requirement on us, and it's an appropriate requirement, is if we've made substantive changes, the public and the regulated community should have an opportunity to comment on those substantive changes. And so that's what would happen. We don't expect that necessarily is going to happen, but if it does, then we would go through that process as well. So that's a little bit of kind of the detail on that process. We also were asked if we would hold additional webinars associated with the rule during that comment period, and I've mentioned already that we would have one once the rule is released. We were asked if there was a prohibition on the landfill implementing these requirements before the rulemaking. There is no prohibition. There are landfills right now that do some treatment of their leachate. Again, they don't go through the full process in most cases, or any cases I'm aware of solidifying and putting that treated leachate back into the landfill, but there are some landfills that try to reduce volume of leachate. That activity is typically associated with a permit modification. So if any landfill wanted to start early, they would very likely have to come in to us and modify their permit in order to do that. But there's nothing stopping them from implementing early. And as I said, there's always a request, and it's understandable for additional and enhanced outreach to regulated, to both the regulated communities and to communities that might be impacted, communities that might be near landfills or might be impacted by the activity. And so we've done what we think is possible in order to do that outreach. We always are ready to do more. If any has recommendations for other entities that need to hear about this, we'd be happy to hear about that. We would ask that people get directed, if you're talking to somebody and they're not familiar with it, direct them to our website. They can see these recorded versions and they can share any information that they have with us. But we will continue on our own side to try to do outreach as broadly as we can to get as many people as possible aware of the rule. Under the topic of applicability, how does this actually affect, and what entities might be covered under the rule? It was mentioned that we specifically are focusing in the proposal, in the expected proposal, on MSW landfills and C&D landfills that collect leachate. There are other types of landfills in the state, such as there's ash monofills, there's industrial waste landfills, there's paper mill sludge landfills. There's a variety of others, but we've chosen these because they are, again, similar to inactive landfills. The vast amount of volume that's being generated. They're the highest number of facilities in the state. So we think we get the best bang for our buck for focusing on these landfill types, but we certainly will take any comment associated with that. I've already spoken a bit about closed landfills, and so that is, we have the current draft focuses on active landfills. But again, we've already received comments on that, and before we finalize, we'll make final decisions on whether that should be adjusted. Another question was, does the proposed rule require active landfills to meet the requirements if they are active at the publication date or at the end of the 4-year time frame? And I kind of alluded to this earlier. So if a landfill closes before the rule comes into effect, then they wouldn't be covered under the notion that only active landfills would be included. There's also a transition component in the rule as it's currently drafted that would allow, if a landfill closes and submits the closure documents and all required documentation to implement facility closure within 2 years of the effective date of the rule, then they also wouldn't be covered. And so that gives landfills an opportunity. There might be a landfill that is close to the end of its operating life, and rather than continue on under the proposed rule, they'd want to close. And so that would be a possibility under the draft as it's currently conceived. So for Part 360 permitting, or the permitting process, there were some questions. What was the estimated time frame for permit review? So we would review applications. We have obligations and timeframes under what's called the Uniform Procedures Act to implement our permit application review under specific timeframes. We would meet all of those timeframes. We'd be obliged to meet all of those timeframes underneath that rule. And we also think that the timeframe that's built into this rule, this sort of basically maybe 2+ years of time to review applications, is sufficient in order to get the process moved from where we are to the final stages of the process. What types of permits would be required under the Part 360 regulations? So the proposal, as I mentioned earlier, this would allow for, it's not just an activity at a landfill. It could be an activity at a third-party location or another location that's not at a landfill. So the draft rule would create a new activity type that might be located at a landfill, or it might be located at another location, but it would be a new activity type under our solid waste management rules, and it would require a permit to operate. And so that would be the permit that would be required under the Part 360 rules. And so there was a specific question about, would an alternative permitted location, such as at a wastewater treatment plant, need a Part 360 permit in addition to their existing permit, which is it's called a Speedies permit. And so, yes, that would be the case. The requirement under this rule would be that the leachate would need to be treated before the treated leachate is sent to a wastewater treatment plant or to a Speedies discharge. And so that means if a landfill or if a wastewater treatment plant wants to treat the leachate at that site, at the wastewater treatment plant site, then it would require a Part 360 series permit in order to do that, in addition to its Speedies permit. And so that would be the case. We had some specific questions associated with the concentrated leachate stream or the treated leachate stream, and then the solidification. So the question is, solidification was mentioned. Could you explain more specifically what is meant by and how landfill will dispose of it? So there are a variety, I mentioned this a bit, there are a variety of different ways that concentrated leachate can be solidified. Often there's an additive that's added through either the pozzolanic material, or a cementitious material, basically something that would set up and create basically a solid once it was mixed with the liquid. And so that's likely to be the case, but each landfill would be required to identify the solidification process that was being used, or each facility that's going to treat leachate would have to identify what solidification process they would use in order to put that concentrated leachate back into that landfill. A question about recirculation. What does the proposed regulation allow for associated with recirculation of treated residuals in this case? But there is a regulatory history associated with, and there's regulations in our current rules that allow for recirculation of raw leachate. It's not a typical activity that's done, but there are some circumstances where leachate gets put back into the landfill in its raw form. That would be changed under this rule, because now all of that leachate would be required to be treated before any of the concentrated leachate was returned to the landfill. And so that language that's currently in the reg associated with recirculation would be removed in the draft. There was an interesting question associated with why the department's talking about solidification and separation as opposed to destruction. Why are we talking about destroying the contaminants in the leachate as opposed to just separating it and putting it back to the landfill? And so that 99.9% removal, for some of the contaminants, theoretically, it could be destroyed as opposed to being just separated and solidified. And so that would be, as far as that goes, that would be a choice that the facility would have to make about the technology they want to use in order to reach that 99.9% removal. But there are some contaminants in leachate that can't be destroyed. So heavy metals are an example of contaminants that can't be destroyed through a treatment process. They only can be separated, and separated is fine. So that destruction is not an option associated with something like a heavy metal. There is a possibility that a treatment facility could choose a series of treatment processes, and some might be destruction and some might be separation. But that would be something that the facilities would have to identify as far as their process, and they'd have to submit to the department. Department would have to approve that, so long as they got to the point where that 99.9% removal happens by the end of those sequence of processes. That's what's contemplated right now. But that was an interesting question. Some specific questions associated with the treatment requirements and the minimum performance standards. So how will compliance with 99.9% contaminant removal how will it be calculated? Specifically, will there be a baseline established based on the average of data over a certain period of time? So what would be done is that we already have leachate. We already have sampling associated with leachate, and that has all the information that is required in our 363 4.6H. And so those would be the numbers that would be used to show the reduction requirement. If over the course of time going forward, those concentrations are reduced, then that would change the percentage that needs to be reduced. Or if they increase, theoretically, those percentages would have to be increased. And so those that would be the criteria, that would be the way that specific performance standard would be set and identified. There were questions about what list of contaminants might be included. As I said, these requirements in tables 3A, 3B in section 363 4.6H. Maybe I keep saying that, maybe my colleagues can post that into the chat just so that folks can see where that reference is in our part 363. There's also an important concept if there is a part of the reason that we can't be explicit associated with the specific concentration for a specific compound is there will likely be some circumstances where there will be a compound in a leachate that is either not present or it's very low in concentration, maybe near the detection limit of the instruments that are reading that are measuring the concentrations in the leachate. So this is a concept in analytical chemistry of a detection limit. So the instruments that are used for measuring the amount of something in a material can only go to a certain down to a certain level. And so if a compound doesn't exist or is such low concentration as below the quote unquote detection limit of the instrument, then there wouldn't be an ability to reduce it by 99.9%. There wouldn't be a need to, because it was already be at the point where it would basically have already been treated. So that's something that would be dealt with on a case-by-case basis, looking at the specific contaminant loading and the specific contaminants in a specific leachate, and then the landfill would have to identify to us, and we'd have to agree that those concentrations were so low that they would not have to meet that 99.9% because it basically had already been done in a way of thinking. I'm going to move forward a little bit here because I know that there are some questions that are coming in, and I want to leave us enough time to answer some of the questions that are being shared today. One of the questions associated with cost in previous discussions was, is there a cost? Is there an estimated cost increase specifically for consumers or customers, for landfill customers? Do we know what that increase might be? And I think I said in the previous event, and I will stand by it, that I'm hesitant about this number because, again, as I said, this is all going to be contingent on what choices that are made by landfills. If they build their own treatment system, that's going to change their cost structure versus sending to another site for treatment. And so it's unclear to us what the actual what the actual impact might be. However, when we looked at the costs and we'll include those costs in the supporting documents, we think of that as a worst case, but because it's a number associated with the amount of with each one of these landfills having to build their own treatment system. And under that requirement and under that circumstance, our estimate of the impact to a customer is in the neighborhood of several dollars a month of an increase, maybe $2 or $3, $4 a month of increase based on the cost of the treatment. That's our estimate right now, and we think that that's again, we think that that is a very conservative estimate. We don't think it's likely to be as high as that because it's unlikely that each one of the landfills will build its own treatment system. The cost will change associated with that. There was an interesting question about local law, and I think it's important to mention that the question was, how will local laws play a part in implementing the rules? There are local laws are not superseded by state solid waste management facility regulations. We under New York State Constitution, there's a concept called home rule, and those local laws still need to be met. And so regardless of what specific requirements we have, if there's a local law that doesn't allow for it, then our regulations don't supersede that. And so both the state requirements under regulation or law and local laws or local regulations would have to be met by any facility. So I think I'm gonna stop there on these questions. And we have about 20 minutes left. And again, as I've seen out of the corner of my eye, I know that there have been some comments that have been submitted, and I know my colleagues have been working through them. So I wanted to make sure that we left a little bit of time for those questions, anything that we might be able to ask. Jamie Lang is the Bureau Director for the Bureau of Solid Waste Management. And during the last session, she asked me questions that were coming in on the chat. And so I would ask if there are any other questions that have come in right now that are different than ones we've already talked about, and that might be worthwhile talking about while we're all together.
Thanks, Rick. So yep, we had some additional questions come in. Someone asked, have other states considered or implemented similar rulemaking specifically related to PFAS treatment requirements, or is New York State the first?
From my understanding, thanks, James. From my understanding, we are the first state to require this as broadly as we're approaching it, not just PFAS, but for other contaminants that aren't treated at a wastewater treatment plant. There are other states where work has been done associated with this. I believe Vermont might have some regulations that are at least in place or that they're developing. I think that those are specific to PFAS, and there might be other states that are focusing on PFAS specifically. But my understanding is we are likely, or we're one of the early states, regardless, that might be taking this approach associated with treatment of leachate prior to being sent for treatment at a wastewater treatment plant.
Next question. If a landfill with an active phase also has older phases that are closed and capped under Part 363, will those older phases be considered inactive and therefore excluded from this requirement?
So that's an interesting question. That's one that we were asked at the last session. So there is a difference under our programs. There's a difference. There are inactive landfills, closed landfills that have been completely capped and covered and are in what we call post-closure. And so those are maintained. Groundwater has to be groundwater in the area of that landfill has to be sampled and analyzed to make sure that there's no impacts to groundwater in that area. Covers have to be maintained. That's a closed landfill under our rules, or version of an inactive landfill, so to speak. Most active landfills, though, in the state are, in some ways, you might think of them as a combination of these two things. So there are active cells where waste is actively going into the landfill. And then there are cells that have been closed and capped, or at least interim cover put on them. They might have a final cover, but some parts do. The way to think about this is a landfill sort of kind of works in cells and in phases, and it moves from place to place on the landfill's footprint. And those cells are smaller volume by a lot than the broader landfill. And so those cells are filled, they're closed, and then they move on to the next cell. And so there might be whole portions of a landfill that might look like a closed landfill, very similar to a closed landfill. They already have the final cover on, but they are part of the active landfill. And so they're still considered to be part of the active landfill. There's not like there are two different landfills at that site. One of them are closed and one of them are open. They are all components of the active landfill. And so all of the leachate that's generated from those is typically collected through the same system and would be received and would be treated into the same system. So, I might be going on a limb. I don't think it's much of a limb to say that almost all, if not all, of the 32 sites that are currently in consideration for this rule have closed portions of that site, and they have cells that have been closed, no longer receiving waste. They're filled up to their permitted limits. Leachate is being collected from those cells into in the active leachate collection system and is being currently sent for disposal. And so that leachate would be a part of this rule. That leachate would be collected and would be required to be treated before moving on. And so hopefully that is a kind of a nuance of our program, and it might not be obvious to anyone who's not familiar with the landfill, but that is an important question. I appreciate you asking it. Thank you.
Next question. Would leachate concentrate generated through treatment be considered hazardous under state or federal law and therefore require disposal at a landfill permitted to manage hazardous waste?
So based on the numbers that we've seen, we don't expect that this is going to be hazardous waste. It would have to be go through a hazardous waste evaluation, identification of whether it's hazardous waste, but we don't believe that it's going to be hazardous waste based on our evaluation so far. So we expect that the concentrated leachate will be able to go into a solid waste landfill, be solidified, and then go into the solid waste landfill.
You stated during the presentation that the wastewater treatment plant can decide to accept or not accept the treated leachate post-implementation of the treatment solution and achievement of the performance standards. That seems to present a huge risk on the landfill with regards to sustainability.
Could you read that one more time? I just want to make sure I have it right.
You stated during the presentation that the wastewater treatment plant can decide to accept or not accept the treated leachate post-implementation of the treatment solution and achievement of the performance standards. That seems to present a huge risk on the landfill with regards to sustainability.
Okay, that's fair. Thank you. So it's very likely in my mind, I don't remember specifically saying that. I probably did say it, but I'll clarify it, I guess, a little bit. It's likely that the treated leachate would, we've never encountered the scenario where we expect a wastewater treatment plant to not receive the untreated leachate, or the treated leachate, the effluent off of the treatment system. It's very likely that most landfills will receive that leachate. Will probably still consider to still require some type of payment associated with it. I would expect that, even if it's nominal, given the concentrations. So it's an interesting question, and we'll give it more thought. But to date, we haven't really thought about a scenario where, or really thought it was an issue that the treated leachate would not be able to be received at a wastewater treatment plant. We also, that it's very possible that the treatment technologies that would be used under this rule could generate an effluent or a treated leachate stream that could be direct discharged. It could get its own speedies permit, and it could be direct discharged from the facility or from a discharge location. So that would be another option, another potential option for either the landfill or the treatment facility that's treating the leachate. Also, I'll add that under the current scenario, landfills often use multiple or enter into contracts with multiple wastewater treatment plants in order to make sure they have an outlet for their raw leachate right now. I would expect that we would require similar requirements. If a landfill comes in and says, we are pursuing and we will have a speedies discharge permit, so we're not going to have an issue with a bottleneck or a restriction on where the treated leachate might go, that would be a different scenario. But if the landfill or the treatment facility says, we are going to identify wastewater treatment plants that are going to receive our treated leachate, we would expect that there would be multiple wastewater treatment plants that would be identified, maybe a primary, maybe secondaries. So it would behoove the facility and it would behoove the department to make sure that those types of restrictions or those types of bottlenecks don't happen. We want to make sure that whatever the material is, the concentrated material gets solidified and goes into the landfill, and the treated material has an outlet. And we want to make sure that that's the case, and that would be part of a permit application in our review when those applications come in.
Wouldn't it be easier to upgrade the wastewater treatment plants to handle emerging contaminants? If the leachate discharge from a landfill comprises just a minute fraction of the total flow to a wastewater treatment plant, could that be considered as the treatment?
It would not be allowed to be considered as the treatment within this rule. The rule would expressly require that the landfill leachate be treated before it goes to the wastewater treatment plant. And there are also, so this has been considered, certainly, and it's a fair question. From the wastewater treatment side, I don't want to speak too much about that because it's not my program, but I know that it's been looked into about what would the costs would be associated with treatment of these other types of compounds that aren't naturally treated in a wastewater treatment plant. My understanding of that is the costs associated with that more dilute stream being treated are astronomical, much higher than the costs that would be associated with treatment of the discrete either industrial streams or leachate streams that are being directed to the wastewater treatment plants. So the costs actually are less if you treat a more concentrated stream upstream of the wastewater treatment plant. The costs are significantly higher for the wastewater treatment plant to have to add on technologies to treat the full load of material of flow into their facilities. And there are other pieces to this. There are more just beyond this rule. There are other efforts across the department to go back up the stream and try to find either industrial sources of PFAS compounds or of other types of compounds that can't be treated at the facility to try to reduce the loading at the wastewater treatment plant. There is, as far as PFAS goes, there is some amount of loading from municipal or from residential sources. PFAS and other types of these compounds are generated in some cases from residences. And so there are other parts of our programs that are trying to identify that and try to reduce as much as we can the amount of those types of materials that are in solid waste to reduce the amount of that material that's going into the residential side of this. But this is an effort that focuses on what we know is a very concentrated stream of material that has PFAS and has heavy metals and has industrial waste in it already. And this is a pinch point. This is a point where we have a very discrete and concentrated amount of material that in a reasonable way can be treated before it moves on to the next next destination. And so that's why we think it's important and that's why I went through the process of the conversation about our mass basis as opposed to the health-based or ecological based determinations. this material was sent to the landfill, was always intended to go and stay in the landfill. It's just kind of the physical nature of the landfill that is causing it to be picked up by the leachate and for currently being removed from the landfill. And that's what we're trying to stop.
Did you consider having the landfills? Did you consider requiring the landfills to have leachate treatment upon their next landfill permit renewal, similar to the transition rules from the 2017 Part 360 rulemaking?
Yeah, that's a fair question. And so maybe I'll go a little bit back on that. So we've had several rulemakings that we've done. We do in our program, we do a lot of rulemakings. And we did two very broad rulemakings that we called them comprehensive rules. And so one of them that was completed in 2017, and actually that rulemaking we released in 2016, and we got comments that were significant, that we needed to make significant adjustments. So we re-released a new draft rule, and that process was completed in 2017. And so part of what's being referred to here is that the implementation of those regulations, the implementation plan portion of that rule said that those new requirements in that new rule would take effect when a permit came back in, when a landfill came back in for either renewal or a modification. So renewals happen at least every 10 years. Our solid waste management facility permits by law cannot be longer than 10 years. And so theoretically, and it has happened, that there are some landfills that went multiple years operating under the previous regulations because they hadn't done a modification or a modification or a renewal. And so we've took that, and obviously we recognize that because that's something that we've done in previous rules. We chose not to do that in this case because in this case, we want to make sure that the leachate that's being generated is treated as early as possible. And we want to have an even implementation of this requirement across all the landfills in the state. And so we're taking a different path. It's absolutely true that we want to have this rule implemented across the board at all of the landfills that we're talking about, basically in a similar time frame. That the driving factor for that is to make sure that the leachate is treated as early as possible. We don't want to be in a scenario where we have a landfill that's just completed a modification or a renewal right before this rule takes effect, and they are still not treating their leachate 8, 9, 10 years later. That's not something that we're looking for in this. We want to make sure that everybody's treating as early as possible. And that's why we've designed the implementation to be for across the board at the same time for all of the landfills that we're talking.
Thanks, Rick. So I think we've answered all the questions that we're able to answer today. We'll put the email address in the chat again so everybody has it.
Great. Thanks, Jamie. Appreciate it. And so thanks, everybody. These were fantastic questions. I appreciate the questions that we got in the previous session. We've been going through the previous questions, and we'll do the same thing with the questions that we received in the chat today. And so this is just another level of engagement that we're trying to do with this rule. We think it's a very important rule. We want to get the rule out as soon as possible. But we also want to make the rule as effective and as cost effective and as easy to implement as possible. We want it to be effective and protective and easy to implement as we possibly can. And so as much as we possibly can. So the feedback that we get from these types of events is enormously important to us to be able to see where we might have blind spots, where there's something we might not have thought of, or where there might be some particular issue in a particular area that we think we haven't really given consideration. So all of these comments, no matter whether we got to them or not, or whether we talked about them or not, are going to be enormously important to us, and we really appreciate you folks spending your time with us. I see the participants. We still have 131 people right now on the call, and we really appreciate the time that you've dedicated to us. So with that, thanks again. Our email is open, and we will be communicating. Hopefully, we will be doing further communication, especially when we're aware of when the rule is going to be released, and we will move forward from there. So thanks, everybody. Much appreciated.